You know, we all knew Donald Trump was a joke, Stephen Colbert smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But who knew his son would be the sequel no one asked for? The laughter was instant, loud, arrogant, and eager. Studio lights beamed down on Colbert as he stood center stage, soaking in the applause like a performer feeding off the energy of a crowd drunk on mockery. But what the audience didn't realize was that this night wasn't going to follow the usual script. Because just 10 feet away from that glowing desk, at the edge of the set, seated calmly under the soft blue hue of the studio lights, sat Barron Trump. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't even supposed to be there. Yet there he was, taller than most expected, composed, dressed in a simple navy suit that made him look more like a young statesman than a celebrity's son. His eyes weren't wide with shock or hurt. They were steady, focused. And beside him sat a single chair, empty. It was reserved for him. Yes, this wasn't just a typical night. Stephen Colbert had invited Barron Trump on the show, not for a friendly chat, but for spectacle, for ratings, for liberal applause. And Barron had said yes, not to be polite, not to defend his father. He came to defend himself. Stephen turned back toward the audience, clearly enjoying himself. He waved a hand toward Barron's direction, as if swatting away the idea of subtlety. And there he is, folks. The Prince of Privilege himself, Barron Trump. His voice dripped with theatrical mockery. You know, we almost canceled tonight's show out of respect for children. But then we remembered he's not just any kid. He's a Trump. Laughter again. But this time, not quite as loud. A few in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Barron didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his cuff, eyes fixed straight ahead. His expression wasn't angry. It was unreadable. That unnerved people more than any reaction could have. Stephen leaned over his desk, lowering his voice like he was letting the audience in on a secret. "Barron," he said, "you've never done a real interview before. So I guess we'll start simple. Do you speak for yourself, or do you just repeat whatever Daddy tells you?" A few audible gasps slipped through the audience. That line wasn't just a jab, it was an ambush. Barron's fingers tapped once on the armrest. Then he stood up, smoothly, quietly, and stepped toward the center of the stage. His voice was calm, controlled. "Actually, Stephen," he said, "tonight I speak for every young person who's tired of being mocked by adults who pretend to care about kindness." The room went still. And for the first time all night, Colbert wasn't smiling. Stephen blinked just once and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he looked like he hadn't expected Barron to actually say something, let alone say it like that. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay quiet. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the front row, but even they sounded unsure. Barron stood tall in the middle of the stage, his posture straight, hands loosely at his sides. He didn't try to command attention, he simply held it, without effort. Stephen regained his composure and forced a smirk. "Well," he said slowly, "that was quite the hallmark moment. But let me guess, you're here to tell us how misunderstood your family is, how the media is just mean to you. Because, newsflash, Barron, your dad built a brand out of mocking people. That's not leadership, that's showbiz." He paused, waiting for the crowd to respond, but it didn't. The energy had shifted. Even they could sense it. Barron tilted his head slightly. "You think this is about defending my father?" he asked, his voice steady. "It's not. It's about how people like you, people with millions of viewers, decide which kids are off limits and which ones are fair game." He took a few slow steps toward the desk, his eyes locked on Stephen. When Sasha and Malia Obama were growing up, the press had rules, respect, boundaries. But me? I've been a punchline since I was 10. Stephen opened his mouth, but Barron didn't stop. "You don't have to like my father. You don't have to agree with him. But if you're going to look me in the eye and claim to care about decency, then start acting like it." A single cough broke the silence in the studio. Stephen leaned forward again, but this time, he had no punchline. Stephen shifted in his chair, glancing briefly toward the control booth, as if searching for a reset button that didn't exist. "Well," he said with a forced chuckle, "that was very presidential of you. Maybe we should skip the jokes tonight and just let you give a TED talk." A few audience members laughed, unsure if they were supposed to, but the timing was off. The sarcasm didn't land. Barron didn't even blink. "You hide behind jokes, Stephen," he said calmly. "That's your shield. You make people laugh so they won't question what you're really doing." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "Which is framing your bias as entertainment, tearing people down so you can look like you're standing above them, calling it comedy so you never have to take responsibility." The studio grew quieter with every word. No music, no laughter, just silence. Stephen sat back, trying to reassert control. "Listen," he said, "you came here voluntarily. You knew the show, you knew the tone. And now you're acting surprised that I'm not giving you a safe space?" Barron took one step closer, the gap between guest and host shrinking to nothing. "I didn't come here for a safe space," he said. "I came here to remind you and everyone watching that respect isn't something you give only to the people who agree with you." He paused, then added more softly, but with unmistakable weight, "And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you've been hiding behind the wrong desk all along." The audience was no longer sure whose show they were watching. Stephen leaned forward, folding his hands as if suddenly turning the show into a therapy session. "You talk a big game, Barron," he said, his voice slower now, more measured. "But come on, you're not here just to preach about respect. You're here to fix your family's image. You're trying to rewrite the Trump legacy, one polished sentence at a time." He tilted his head, watching for a crack in Barron's composure. "You may dress like a statesman, but deep down, you're still just another product of the Trump machine. Am I wrong?" For a brief moment, the tension in the room felt like it might snap. But Barron didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the desk, just enough that the space between them became undeniably personal. "No, you're not wrong," he said quietly. "I am part of that legacy." Stephen sat back, mildly surprised. "But legacies aren't fixed," Barron continued. "They're lived. They're earned. And they're tested, especially by people like you." He gestured gently toward the audience. "My father never asked me to defend him. He doesn't need me to. But I will say this, he never taught me to hide behind applause or approval. He taught me to stand my ground." He looked directly into Stephen's eyes. "And that's what I'm doing, right now." The audience was dead silent. Even the cameras, panning slowly, felt more like eyes than machines, capturing not a performance, but a shift. A real human shift. And Stephen Colbert had no script for that. A single pair of hands started clapping in the back row, then another, then silence again. It wasn't a standing ovation, it wasn't even loud, but it was enough to make Stephen shift in his chair. He glanced offstage, clearly aware that something about tonight was slipping out of his hands. The rhythm of the show, the jokes, the timing, the crowd control, it was all unraveling. "I have to admit," Stephen said, his tone more cautious now, "you're good at this. You've got the calm delivery, the perfect sound bites, even the moral high ground. But you're still standing on a foundation built by a man who divided this country." He let the accusation hang in the air, sharp and heavy. Barron nodded slowly. "And yet, I'm standing." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. "I was raised in a world where every sentence I spoke was dissected, where silence was treated as weakness, and presence was mistaken for privilege. But I'm still here." He turned slightly, not just addressing Stephen anymore, but the room itself. "I'm not asking to be liked. I'm asking to be heard without being reduced to a punchline." A few heads in the audience turned toward each other. There were no jokes to follow, no laugh sign flashing above them. Just the uncomfortable realization that something very real was happening, in a place that had never been built for it. Stephen exhaled slowly, then forced a crooked smile. "Well," he muttered into his mic, "we invited Barron Trump and got a lecture from Plato." A few people in the audience laughed, but it was thin, forced, nervous. The timing felt wrong. Even Stephen knew it. He tapped his pen on the desk, trying to redirect the flow. "Let's be honest here, your family brought this on themselves. The lies, the scandals, the chaos. And now you want what? Sympathy? Redemption?" Barron took a breath, not defensive, measured. "I don't expect redemption from you," he replied. "You already made up your mind about me the moment I walked in." Stephen leaned forward. "Then why come here at all?" "To show you I'm not afraid of the room." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. Barron let it sit. He let it sting. Then, someone from the front row spoke quietly, but clear enough to be heard. "Let him talk." Stephen's head turned slightly. It was the kind of moment that didn't need a camera cue. The shift had already happened. And for the first time since Barron had stepped onto that stage, Stephen looked unsure. Stephen glanced toward the control booth again, as if waiting for a producer to save him. No one moved. The cameras kept rolling. Barron turned slightly, facing the crowd for the first time. "You know," he said, "it's strange being talked about for years and never being allowed to speak." He scanned the rows, making eye contact, not as a performer, but as someone who was finally being seen. "I've been called every name. Silent, weird, entitled. Some people even questioned if I could speak at all. And yet, the people who claimed to be the most tolerant laughed the loudest." That line struck. It wasn't angry, it was factual, reflective, honest. I was a teenager, a kid. And while I was growing up, the country decided I wasn't worth protecting because of my last name. A wave of discomfort moved through the audience. Stephen tried to cut in, to take back the rhythm. "You're not the only one who's been criticized, Barron. Public figures get mocked. That's the game." Barron turned back to him, slowly. "I wasn't a public figure. I was just a boy who didn't ask to be part of the game." He paused, then added quietly, "But I learned how to play. And I don't need to be funny to win." No one laughed, no one clapped. But for the first time all night, the silence was no longer Stephen's to command. Stephen's smile cracked for the first time. His eyes narrowed, his fingers tensed around his pen. "So let me get this straight," he said sharply. "You walk onto my show, hijack the tone, lecture my audience, and now you're telling us you're the victim?" His voice was no longer playful. It was biting. Barron didn't react. He let Stephen's words land and evaporate. "You invited me to speak," Barron said, calmly. "You just didn't expect me to say something you couldn't laugh at." Stephen slammed his hand on the desk, not hard, but loud enough to silence the nervous murmurs building in the audience. "You think you're brave? Sitting here in a suit with your polished answers and your moral speeches? Where was all this strength when your father was—" He stopped himself, just for a split second. Barron leaned in, voice low but piercing. "Say it." Stephen hesitated. His instinct said push forward. His audience expected it, but his gut said he was losing. Barron stepped forward, closing the final distance to the desk. "I'm not here to relive my father's legacy," he said. "I'm here to confront people who've made a career out of rewriting it." He gestured toward the cameras. "You think this moment is about you holding me accountable. But it's not. It's about America watching you try and fail to bully someone half your age on national television." A few gasps. A single stunned chuckle. And then applause. Not much, but real. Stephen's jaw tightened. And suddenly, he wasn't hosting the show anymore. Stephen raised both hands as if to diffuse the moment. "Okay," he said, his tone shifting again, calmer, controlled. "Let's not pretend you're some underdog. You're not some kid from the Midwest who stumbled into politics. You're a Trump. You were born with a spotlight." He looked toward the crowd, fishing for agreement. "And if you're going to come on this stage and lecture me about fairness, Then at least admit this. You had the money, the access, the platform. You've had more opportunities than 99% of Americans. A few audience members nodded, relieved Stephen was pushing back. Barron waited, let the applause die, then answered not louder, just clearer. You're right, I was born with access. That's not a secret. But none of that protected me from being turned into a punchline by grown men on national television. He took a few steps forward, slow, controlled, completely unshaken. You say I had a platform? I wasn't even allowed to speak. I was told to smile. Stay quiet, stay out of the way. And the one time I decided not to, here we are. He turned toward the audience now, his voice steady, his presence undeniable. Let's be honest. If I had walked out here tonight and stumbled, said something stupid, cracked under pressure, you would have laughed. You would have called me weak, privileged, spoiled. A hush swept across the rows, but I didn't stumble. I stood up. I spoke clearly. I didn't shout. I didn't insult. And suddenly, that's a problem. His eyes locked with Stephen's again. Maybe the real issue isn't that I'm a Trump, but that I don't fit the version of one you need me to be. This time, the applause came sooner, louder, longer. Stephen looked out at the crowd, and for the first time all night, he had nothing to say. Before Stephen could gather a response, a voice rang out from the second row. Let the kid speak. It wasn't shouted in anger. It was firm, respectful, delivered by a man in his 60s, wearing a veteran's cap and crossed arms. The kind of voice that didn't need a microphone to command attention. A ripple moved through the audience. The tension had changed color. This wasn't just late-night TV anymore. This was something else, something real. Stephen forced a tight smile. Well, I guess I've lost control of my own audience, he joked, but it landed like a lead balloon. He turned back to Barron, trying to regain the spotlight. You're clearly well prepared, he said, tone now coated in condescension. But one good monologue doesn't undo years of what your family stood for. You can't just walk in here, act polite, and expect America to forget. Barron didn't blink. I didn't ask anyone to forget. I asked them to think. Another quiet pause. Barron looked around the studio, not for approval, but for accountability. I don't expect applause. I don't expect forgiveness. I expect people to start holding everyone to the same standard, no matter what name they carry. The veteran nodded slowly from his seat. And then, without warning, a woman in the back row stood up. He's right. Just 2 words. But they hit harder than any scripted punchline Colbert had prepared. Stephen glanced between the audience and Barron. He could feel it now, not just the loss of control, but something worse. He was no longer the smartest man in the room. Stephen stood up from behind his desk. Not in rage, but in instinct. He needed to reclaim presence, command, authority. But as he straightened his jacket and looked out over the audience, the applause he expected didn't come. He looked back at Barron, eyes narrowed. You know what I think? He asked, his voice louder now. Sharper. I think this is all rehearsed. You've had your team coach every word, every pause. You're not speaking from the heart, you're performing, just like your father. A few scattered claps came from the back, but they died quickly. The energy didn't rise. It dipped. Barron didn't move, didn't look rattled, didn't even respond right away. Then calmly he said, If this were a performance, I'd be trying to please you. He turned his head, looking directly at the camera, now not at Stephen, not even at the audience. But I'm not here to please anyone. I'm here because people like you have made it normal to attack anyone who thinks differently, to mock anyone who doesn't play your game. Stephen's smile faded. The room went still. I was 12 when I first became a target. Not because of anything I said or did, but because of my name. And you helped normalize that. You laughed. You let others laugh. And you never once asked if it was okay. He took a step forward, not aggressive, just undeniable. So no, I'm not here to fix a brand. I'm here because I've had enough. And in that moment, Barron wasn't just defending himself. He was speaking for every person who'd ever been laughed at and told it was just a joke. Stephen didn't sit back down. He couldn't. His hands were in his pockets now, not casual, but searching for somewhere to put the tension he couldn't hide anymore. He scanned the audience, looking for support. But the expressions looking back at him weren't amused. They weren't angry either. They were undecided, watching, waiting. "That's rich," he said, voice thinner now. "You come on this stage, flip the script, and suddenly you're the hero? That's not how it works." Barron tilted his head slightly. "I'm not interested in being the hero. I just won't be your villain anymore." The line cut through the air like a blade. Stephen opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. The audience watched him hesitate. He was searching for something to say, some clever retort, a twist, a reversal. But there was nothing left. No punchline. No applause cue. Just silence. Barron folded his hands in front of him, perfectly still. "This show runs on ridicule. But you've never had to answer for what that ridicule does. Tonight, I'm not asking questions, I'm giving answers." Stephen swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper now. "You think you've won something here?" Barron didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because someone in the audience said it for him, loud, clear, undeniable. He already did. A slow clap began, not forced, not ironic, just real. And Stephen, he sat down, not as a host, but as a man who finally realized the room didn't belong to him anymore. The applause faded slowly, but the weight it left behind didn't. Stephen remained seated, his expression unreadable. Maybe it was defeat, maybe it was just disbelief. Barron looked around the studio, then back at the audience, not for approval, but almost as if seeking one person in particular. He didn't find them. So he spoke anyway. "When I was 11, he began, a late-night host made a joke about how I looked like I'd never seen sunlight." He paused, his voice steady. "I didn't understand it at first. I thought it was just weird. I asked my mother why people laughed when I hadn't done anything. She didn't know how to answer. The room was dead silent. I didn't grow up the way people think I did. I had security guards at my school, strangers taking pictures of me through fences. And every time I turned on the TV, there I was made fun of for how I stood, how I walked, how I stayed quiet." He swallowed just once, so eventually I stopped turning it on. Someone in the front row let out a quiet breath, sharp and unintentional. Barron looked back at Stephen. "You say I'm polished, rehearsed, but you gave me no other choice. Because if I ever stumbled even once, you wouldn't forgive it. You'd frame it, replay it, laugh at it." He turned to the crowd one last time. "That's what it's like to grow up with a name you didn't choose." And for a full 10 seconds, no one in the studio made a sound. Because there was nothing left to mock. Stephen sat still, elbows on the desk, fingers laced tightly together. He wasn't cracking jokes. He wasn't playing to the camera. He was just sitting and watching Barron. Something had shifted not just in the room, but inside him. He cleared his throat softly, not to interrupt, but to fill the silence. "You know," he began slowly, "I've done this show for years. Mocked presidents, celebrities, scandals, the absurdity of politics. It's what I do." He paused, looking down at his hands for a moment, something he rarely did on camera. "But I don't think I ever stopped to ask what it feels like to be on the other end of it. When you're not a politician, not a headline, just a kid." Barron didn't move. He just listened. Stephen looked back up. "You're right. I never made jokes about Sasha or Malia. Never about Chelsea. Never even about the Bush twins. But you," he hesitated, then finished, "you were always an exception. And maybe that says more about me than it does about you." The audience didn't know how to respond. There was no cue for this, no laugh sign, no applause, just reality. Stephen leaned back, sighing quietly. I don't agree with your father. Not even a little. But tonight, I saw something I wasn't ready for. And that's on me." Barron nodded once, not a smile. Not a thank you. Just a silent recognition of what that moment really was. Two people, one stage, and for the first time no performance. Stephen straightened in his seat again, his moment of softness already fading. "Well," he said with a sarcastic edge, "that was touching, truly. And now that we've all had our emotional breakthrough, maybe we can get back to reality." He folded his arms. "You say you're not your father, Barron. But let's look at the facts. You came out here, spoke like a polished conservative pundit, dropped all the buzzwords, media bias, double standards, mocked for your name. It's the same script, just a younger voice." Barron arched an eyebrow. "Is it easier for you to dismiss me than to engage with what I actually said?" Stephen leaned in, voice sharper now. "What you said. You walked onto this stage and acted like your family has been victimized. Let me remind you, your father banned refugees. He mocked disabled reporters. He called journalists the enemy of the people." A few claps erupted in the audience. Finally, something familiar. Stephen took the opening and pushed harder. "And now his son wants to lecture us on empathy, on respect? Spare me the moral high ground. This country barely survived the first round of Trump values. You want to bring them back dressed in a nicer suit?" Barron's eyes didn't leave Stephen's face. "I'm not here to repackage anything," he said, calm but unwavering. "I'm here because the people who preach tolerance turned out to be the first to abandon it. Especially when it came to anyone who thinks like me." Stephen scoffed. "Thinks like you? You mean white, rich, powerful?" Barron didn't flinch. "I mean believing in tradition, in faith, in strong borders, in family, in honoring your country, not apologizing for it." And just like that, the tone of the room shifted again. Colbert had just awakened something he might not be able to put back to sleep. Stephen chuckled dryly, leaning forward like a man about to pounce. "Family, faith, strong borders," he repeated mockingly. "You forgot apple pie and 1950s sitcoms. Is that what this is? The next generation of nostalgia politics?" Barron didn't react. He stood calmly, hands folded in front of him. "No," he replied. "It's called knowing what you stand for, even when the world tells you not to." Stephen's grin tightened. "You talk about tradition like it's some sacred relic. But let's be real, half of those values you're defending have been used to justify exclusion, discrimination, even oppression." Barron raised his chin slightly. "And yet, without them, what's left? A society that apologizes for its past instead of learning from it. A country that tears down its own identity just to be accepted by people who don't even believe in it." A murmur swept through the audience. It wasn't outrage, it was attention, real, focused attention. Stephen's tone sharpened. "So what, you want to close the borders? Build walls? Keep everyone out who doesn't pray the way you do or vote the way your father did?" Barron shook his head. "I want a country that protects its people without hating others. That believes in sovereignty without shame. That understands compassion without surrendering its foundation." Stephen scoffed. "Sounds like a campaign speech." Barron looked him dead in the eye. "Maybe it's just the kind of speech you're not used to hearing, one that doesn't need a laugh track to feel honest." This time, the silence wasn't awkward. It was electric. Stephen leaned back, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate calm. "You know what this feels like?" he said, almost casually, like we're watching the same show, just with a different lead actor. He looked Barron up and down, eyes narrowed. "You're just your father in better tailoring, slicker delivery, nicer voice, but the same script, the same arrogance wrapped in values." A few soft claps came from the far left side of the audience, but the applause didn't spread. Barron's jaw tightened, just slightly. He didn't smile. He didn't defend. Instead, he stepped closer to the host's desk, voice firm but restrained. "You keep trying to reduce me to him. As if I don't exist without him. Stephen raised an eyebrow, but Barron continued. My father's not perfect. I know that. We don't agree on everything, but he taught me one thing you'll never understand. Stephen smirked. Oh, I can't wait to hear this. Barron's tone sharpened, just enough to cut through the sarcasm. He taught me that if you stand for something real, the world will try to turn you into a villain, especially if you don't apologize for believing in it. He paused. And I won't apologize for respecting borders. I won't apologize for loving my country. And I won't apologize for carrying his name. Now the silence hit different. Even the camera seemed to hesitate. Stephen blinked. So, you're proud of him? Barron looked straight ahead. I'm proud to be my father's son. But I'm not here to imitate him. I'm here to remind people that the values we stood for still matter, whether you like the messenger or not. There it was. And this time, no one dared to laugh. Stephen glanced at the audience, eyes flashing with one last attempt at control. Wow, he said, adjusting his tie with exaggerated flair. That was beautiful, really. Someone call Mount Rushmore, we found our next statue. The audience laughed. Not all, but enough to give him a breath of confidence. He pressed on. I mean, come on, this whole thing. It's performance art. You don't come onto a comedy show dressed like a senator unless you're trying to send a message. He turned to the camera, grinning. And that message is, I'm 15 going on Fox News. More laughter. But this time, thinner, less confident. It didn't echo, it bounced. Barron stayed still. His gaze didn't shift. When the room quieted again, he finally spoke. You make jokes when you feel threatened. Stephen blinked. You think mockery makes you clever. But all it does is show how uncomfortable you get when someone challenges your narrative. He stepped closer, slow, calm, unbothered. You called this a performance, but let me ask you something, Stephen. If I stood here stuttering, stumbling, sounding clueless, would you be nicer to me? Stephen didn't answer. Of course not, Barron said. Because people like you don't want conversations, you want targets. He turned to the crowd now. You didn't invite me here to talk. You invited me to lose. Pause, but I didn't. A quiet gasp slipped through the studio. And for the first time that night, even Colbert didn't have a line ready. Stephen shifted in his seat, tapping his pen against the desk once, twice, a little too fast. His usual smirk was gone. What replaced it wasn't anger, it was discomfort. He glanced toward the crew, toward the teleprompter, then back to Barron. None of it helped. You really think you've got this all figured out, don't you? He said finally, voice tighter than before. One night, one microphone, and suddenly you're the voice of conservative America? Barron shook his head, calm as ever. I'm not the voice of anything. I'm not running for office. I'm not here to convert anyone. He paused, then added with quiet precision. I'm just here to say what you won't let others say. Stephen leaned forward. And what's that, exactly? That America was better 50 years ago? That we should just close the borders and pray more? Barron didn't blink. That hard work matters. That family matters. That we don't have to be ashamed of our country just to prove we're compassionate. A few heads in the audience nodded visibly. Stephen saw it. And he hated that he saw it. This country has problems, he shot back, voice rising slightly. And pretending like waving a flag solves them is naive. Barron stepped closer to the desk, his tone sharp but steady. Loving your country isn't pretending. It's choosing to fix its flaws without tearing down its foundation. That line hit hard. Too hard to laugh off. Stephen opened his mouth. But a woman in the third row spoke first. He's right. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. Stephen turned toward her, stunned. For the first time, the audience wasn't watching him for a punchline. They were watching Barron for truth. Stephen leaned back again, clearly regrouping. His voice now carried a more cynical tone. Oh, here we go, he muttered. Next you'll tell me we need prayer back in schools and crosses on every highway. Is that the part where I'm supposed to feel guilty for living in the 21st century? Barron didn't react. He was past the bait. I don't want anyone forced to believe in anything, he said plainly. But I do want the freedom to believe without being mocked for it. Stephen laughed, a single short burst. Come on. Nobody's mocking belief. They're mocking hypocrisy. Barron's voice stayed even. No, they're mocking faith. Every time someone says grace, talks about God, or shares a conviction rooted in tradition, people like you roll your eyes and call it dangerous. He looked straight into the camera now. We say God bless America, and suddenly we're extremists. We talk about faith in schools, and suddenly we're oppressors. But when a liberal celebrity posts a rainbow flag with a Bible verse photoshopped underneath, you call it brave. The room was locked in now. Every word felt sharper, more real. Stephen tried to cut in. You're twisting it. But Barron didn't stop. You think tolerance means you can silence people you disagree with, that morality only counts when it comes from your side. Now some of the audience members weren't just quiet. They were nodding. And the moment someone mentions faith or traditional values or anything older than 5 years ago, you call them a threat. Stephen looked down at his desk, then back up visibly rattled. Maybe we are threatened, he said flatly. Because that version of America left a lot of people behind. Barron's response came without pause. No, that version of America had flaws, but it also had standards. And now we have confusion, dressed up as progress. And this time, there was no laughter, no applause sign needed. The audience simply understood. Stephen sat motionless for a moment, as if weighing whether to respond or just let it slide. But Barron didn't wait. He turned again to the audience, not to grandstand, but to level with them. I know who I am, he said plainly. That's not arrogance. That's survival. The words were simple, but they hit hard. I didn't grow up trying to be liked. I grew up trying to stay grounded. When your name becomes a headline before you can vote, you either lose yourself or you hold on to what matters. Stephen raised an eyebrow. And what matters, Barron? Status? Legacy? Your last name? Barron didn't hesitate. No, he said. My name will always be controversial to some people. That's not something I control. He paused. But I know where I come from. I know who raised me. I know the values they fought to protect, even when they weren't popular, even when the media twisted every word, even when late-night hosts turned it into a joke. A few murmurs stirred in the audience again, this time not nervous, but reflective. I'm not confused about who I am, Barron continued. But I live in a country where more and more people are. He looked back at Stephen. People are told to question everything, except the people telling them to question everything. Stephen scoffed, but didn't interrupt. And we wonder why no one feels grounded anymore, why family breaks down, why kids are angry, why truth is whatever gets the most likes. He paused, looked around the room, and added, I'm not trying to be a hero. I just want to live in a country where being consistent isn't treated like a flaw. That landed heavier than any dramatic punch, because for many in the room, it was exactly what they'd been thinking, but never heard said out loud. Stephen exhaled, slow and sharp, like someone trying to scrape back some authority with tone alone. You really think you're the voice of truth, don't you? He said, the sarcasm back in full force. You sit here and talk about confusion and integrity like you've spent your life reading Plato instead of flying on private jets. He gestured toward the audience, shaking his head. This isn't wisdom. It's a right-wing echo chamber dressed in prep school vocabulary. You sound like someone who's been watching too much Fox News and not enough reality. That one got a few predictable laughs, mostly from the usual corners. Stephen pushed forward, tone rising. You talk about family and God and identity like they're under attack. But here's a thought. Maybe the only thing under attack is your comfort. He leaned forward, voice sharp. Maybe America isn't broken. Maybe it's just moving past what your family stood for. The audience waited. But the weight in the room wasn't on Stephen anymore. It was on Barron. And he didn't flinch. He looked at Stephen not with anger, but something deeper. Pity. I don't need to be the voice of truth, he said. I just refuse to let you be the only one speaking. Stephen's expression twitched. And you know what I've learned? Barron continued. People who mock faith usually lost theirs. People who laugh at tradition usually miss it. And people who label conviction as privilege are usually just afraid of anyone who doesn't need their approval. The crowd was silent again. Then Barron added softly, but powerfully, If I'm just repeating my father, why do you look so uncomfortable? That line cracked through the room like lightning. Stephen looked stunned. The audience didn't laugh. Because deep down they knew the answer. Barron didn't move from his spot, but suddenly, it felt like the entire studio had shifted around him. He wasn't just answering questions anymore. He was owning the moment. His eyes scanned the rows of faces in front of him, some skeptical, some curious, many simply silent. I don't expect everyone here to agree with me, he began, voice calm but resonant. Some of you probably walked in thinking I was just a spoiled kid trying to clean up a family name. He paused, then added, maybe some of you still think that. No one laughed. But ask yourself this, when was the last time you heard someone speak from conviction instead of fear? When was the last time someone looked you in the eye and said what they believed? Without apologizing for it afterward, the room was still. Even the camera crew seemed frozen in place. I'm not asking for your applause, Barron continued. I'm asking you to look around, at your country, at your communities, at your children. Are they better off now than they were 10 years ago? He turned slowly, addressing different sections of the audience. Are our streets safer? Are our schools stronger? Are our families closer? Or are we more divided, more angry, and more confused while the people in power tell us we're making progress? A low murmur moved through the crowd, not disagreement, recognition. Stephen remained seated, quiet now, no longer smirking. Barron continued, You don't have to like me. You don't even have to like my father. But if you're going to laugh at people who still believe in truth, in family, in country, then maybe the joke isn't on them. He paused just long enough. Maybe the joke's on us. And in that moment, for the first time all night, nobody was laughing. Stephen shifted forward, hands clasped, voice low and deliberate. All right, Barron, he said, carefully choosing each word. You've had your moment. You've said your piece. But let me ask you something directly, no spin, no speeches. He narrowed his gaze. If your father wasn't who he was, would you still be sitting in that chair? The audience murmured. It was the kind of question meant to corner, to trap. It had the scent of finality, like a checkmate waiting to be claimed. Barron didn't blink. He let the question sit, allowed the audience to absorb the weight of it. Then he replied, slow and steady, Probably not. A few in the audience leaned back, surprised by the honesty. But here's the difference, Barron added. I'm not ashamed of that. Stephen's brow furrowed. I was born into a name I didn't choose, Barron continued. But I choose what I do with it. I could have stayed silent. I could have lived comfortably, let people define me however they wanted. But I didn't. He leaned in slightly. Because sooner or later, all of us inherit something. A name, a belief, a country. He paused, locking eyes with Stephen. And the real question isn't where we come from. It's what we're willing to stand for when it's our turn. There it was. Not a comeback, not a counterattack, just truth. And for the second time that night, Stephen Colbert had no reply. Stephen leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, the flicker of a smile returning, though this time it felt hollow. You make it all sound so noble, he said dryly. Patriotism. Family, standing up for tradition. It's a great pitch. He gestured vaguely toward the crowd. But let's be honest, those are just buzzwords now. Used to sell books, win elections, rile up the base. Half the people shouting freedom don't even vote. And family values? Please, that phrase lost meaning years ago. A few chuckles echoed through the audience, but they were half-hearted. Stephen pressed on. Do you really think waving a flag and quoting your dad is going to change anything? Or are you just here to remind us how much noise the right can make? Without actually saying anything new, Barron waited. Let the words hang, then stepped forward again. I'm not here to sell anything, he said. And I'm not here to sound new. I'm here to say something old, that people are trying really hard to forget. He paused. We are a country built on responsibility, not just rights. On families that teach, not the government. On faith that gives people hope, not headlines. Stephen raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Barron looked into the camera again, not for show, but for clarity. And if that sounds old-fashioned to you, maybe the problem isn't the message. Maybe the problem is how far we've drifted from it. He turned his gaze back to Stephen. You mock tradition because it holds up a mirror. And deep down, a lot of people don't like what they see anymore. This time, the audience didn't just stay quiet. They leaned in. Not toward Stephen, toward Barron, because finally, someone was saying what they were afraid to admit. Stephen saw his opening and took it. You want to talk about responsibility? He said, voice rising. Fine, let's talk about January 6th. A visible tension snapped through the audience. You stand here talking about tradition and country like it's sacred, but your father's supporters stormed the Capitol. People died, police were attacked, and your dad? He's facing indictments for inciting it. He leaned forward, voice now thick with accusation. Where was your sacred America that day, Barron? Where was your truth then? A few in the audience clapped harsh, sudden. Stephen looked satisfied, like he'd finally forced the moment. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded. You're right, he said simply. Stephen blinked. The audience did too. That day was a disgrace, Barron continued. Not because of flags or party lines, but because people forgot what this country stands for. You don't defend democracy by breaking windows. You don't protect freedom by threatening lives. He let that sit for a beat, then added, and my father will have to answer for his part, just like everyone else. Stephen opened his mouth, but Barron kept going. But don't twist that into a reason to erase everything he stood for. Because the same people who screamed about democracy that day, they're the ones who burned cities for months and called it justice. Now the room shifted again hard. And don't pretend that mob represents everyone who voted for him. Because if one group's extremists define the whole, then none of us are innocent. A silence fell so complete, even Stephen didn't move. And if we're really going to talk about accountability, Barron said, locking eyes with him, let's stop pretending one side owns all the blame. That landed like a hammer. Because deep down, even those who hated what he said knew it wasn't a lie. Stephen leaned forward, jaw tight, voice darker now. You're slick, he said, not even trying to hide the bite. You know how to talk, how to dodge, how to sound reasonable. He paused, then added louder. But you're still just a polished version of the same thing. Same arrogance, same blind loyalty. Same smug belief that being a Trump makes you untouchable. His tone cut deep, and the audience felt it. The air had grown colder. I've interviewed people with real stories, Stephen snapped. Activists, veterans, survivors, and you? You walk in here, son of a billionaire, telling us about suffering and values like you're Moses coming down the mountain. A few laughs came from the far left of the audience, but they were short-lived. Barron didn't blink, didn't even move. Instead, he looked Stephen straight in the eyes. I never said I was untouchable, he said quietly. But I'm not invisible either. Stephen narrowed his eyes. You talk about real stories, Barron continued. Then listen to mine. I've watched people scream that I should be locked up before I could even drive. I've seen grown adults laugh about my family breaking apart like it was comedy gold." He paused. "Let the moment breathe. But the difference between me and most people on your side of the aisle? I still believe in a country where we can disagree without destroying each other." Now he turned toward the audience again. "America doesn't need more outrage. It needs more strength, quiet strength. The kind that doesn't fold every time someone calls you a name." A few heads nodded slowly. "We're broken not because we disagree," Barron said, "but because we stopped listening. And because too many people built their careers," he looked back at Stephen, "by mocking those who still believe in something bigger than themselves." Stephen sat still, and for the first time in the entire interview, his silence wasn't tactical, it was real. Stephen finally broke the silence, his voice lower, now tired, but still laced with sarcasm. "All right," he said, forcing a smirk. "So what's next then? You save America with a mic and a monologue?" A few strained chuckles slipped out from scattered seats, but even those felt like echoes of a show that had already moved on. Barron didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He just breathed in slowly, then spoke with quiet precision. "No," he said, "but maybe I can help remind people that saving the country doesn't start in Washington. It starts in living rooms, in schools, at the dinner table." Stephen tilted his head. Barron continued, "We've built a culture where shouting wins, where headlines matter more than values, where being offended is more important than being honest." He looked into the camera now, but his voice didn't rise. "And if we keep going that way, left or right, then it won't matter who wins the next election, because we'll lose everything that made this country worth fighting for in the first place." The audience had grown completely still. No coughing, no shuffling. Just stillness. Stephen sat back, no retort ready. Barron looked at him one last time. "You say I sound rehearsed? Maybe I do. But that's because I've spent years listening to people talk about America like it's a punchline." He took one small step forward. "Well, I'm done laughing." The studio lights hummed. The cameras kept rolling. But in that moment, it felt like no one was watching the show anymore. They were watching a shift. Before Stephen could open his mouth to pivot or recover, a voice broke through the silence gravelly, slow, unmistakably real. "I never thought I'd agree with a Trump." The entire audience turned. An older man, maybe late 60s, stood halfway back in the studio, his face weathered, his eyes clear. "But tonight." "I do." Stephen looked stunned. Even Barron shifted slightly, not in pride, but in respect. The man didn't wait for permission to speak. He didn't need it. "I fought in Vietnam," he said. "Came back to a country that hated the war and hated me for fighting it." A few gasps. Others turned to listen more closely. "And I've watched for years how we started treating disagreement like betrayal. How we stopped raising men with backbones and started raising people afraid of offending anyone." He looked at Barron directly now. "You've got one hell of a backbone, son." The audience didn't erupt. It didn't cheer wildly. It just stood still, listening. The man nodded, slowly. "You can say what you want about his family, about politics, but that boy speaks more sense than half of Washington combined." He turned toward Stephen, "And mocking him won't change that." Stephen's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. The veteran sat back down, folding his arms, calm, grounded, finished. And in that moment, Barron didn't need a comeback, because America had just spoken from the third row. The studio remained hushed. Stephen sat still, his expression unreadable. Barron didn't move for a moment. He just looked down briefly, then back up. "I didn't come here tonight to win anything," he said softly. "Not a debate, not approval, not applause." He looked around the studio, not just the audience, but the space itself. "I came here because I'm part of a generation that's been told we're lost, that we're entitled, confused, angry, and maybe some of that's true." He took a slow step forward, not dramatic, just purposeful. But we didn't get here on our own. We watched grown men tear each other apart on cable news. We watched celebrities mock decency like it was weakness. We watched leaders promise everything and deliver nothing. He turned back to the crowd. And now we're expected to fix it, without values, without structure, without knowing who we are. A few in the audience shifted this time, not uncomfortably. They were listening. "I don't claim to have the answers," Barron said. "But I know what I'm not willing to do. I'm not willing to be quiet just because people don't like who I am. I'm not willing to trade truth for trends. And I'm not willing to stand by while my generation is handed a broken country wrapped in a smiling headline." The room was silent, no applause sign, no music. Just real time and real weight. Stephen still hadn't spoken. Because this was no longer a conversation. It was a statement. And no one could argue with the silence that followed it. Stephen finally straightened in his chair. His voice, when it returned, was softer measured, almost gentle ... "Well," he said slowly, "I'll give you this, you're composed. You're articulate, and you've clearly thought a lot about this." A pause. "So here's my question." He leaned forward slightly. "If you're so sure about what you believe, if your values are that strong, why come here at all?" He gestured subtly to the studio, the cameras, the seats. "Why sit in this chair, in this space, on this stage, if you already know people like me won't agree with you?" The tone was civil. But Barron saw through it instantly. He didn't smile. Didn't hesitate. "I came here," he said plainly, "because people like you have spent years speaking for people like me." Stephen blinked. "I came here to remind you that being loud doesn't make you right, that a talk show isn't truth, that jokes don't replace facts." He stood tall, not towering, not grandiose, just still, clear. "And I came here to show every young person watching that you don't have to sit down when someone powerful tries to tell you who you are." The room was quiet again, but this time it felt settled, like something had just landed that couldn't be moved. Stephen looked at him longer than before, and for the first time, he didn't look like a host. He looked like a man who realized. He had just handed over the last word. Barron didn't look at Stephen anymore. He wasn't addressing him. His eyes scanned the studio slowly, then settled somewhere in the middle distance, as if speaking to someone who wasn't even in the room. "When I was a kid," he began quietly, "I used to think silence was safety." He paused, not for effect, but because it was real. "That if I didn't speak, they couldn't twist my words. If I didn't react, they couldn't say I was angry. If I didn't show anything, they couldn't break anything." The audience was silent. Not a single sound. But over time, I realized something worse than being hated is being erased. He looked down for a second, then back up more centered than ever. "I watched people talk about me like I was a rumor, a symbol, a meme. And every time I stayed quiet, I lost a little more of myself." Now he turned to the crowd. "I'm not a politician. I'm not a movement. I'm just a young man who refuses to be defined by people who've never met me." He exhaled slowly. "I don't need everyone to agree with me. I just need enough people to listen before it's too late." And somehow, that was louder than any standing ovation could have ever been. A few seconds passed. Then a woman in the front row stood up slowly, silently. She didn't cheer. She didn't clap. She just stood. Tears welled in her eyes, and she pressed her hand over her heart. One row behind her, a man in his 40s rose to military posture, eyes fixed on Barron. No words. Just respect. Then another, and another. Within moments, half the studio was on its feet. No one was yelling. No one was chanting. It was the kind of applause that didn't need volume. It just needed truth. Stephen remained seated. His eyes darted across the audience, trying to process what he was witnessing. This wasn't a political rally. It wasn't even about Trump anymore. It was about a young man who had stood in the fire and refused to burn. Barron looked out at the crowd, his expression steady, humble, Not victorious, not smug, just present. And in that stillness, in that rising wall of silent support, the message was clearer than ever. This wasn't a performance, it was a moment. And it belonged to him. Stephen finally spoke again, though his voice had lost its edge. "All right," he said, almost under his breath. "You've made your point." He looked around, visibly unsettled by the standing crowd. "You came here, said your piece, and clearly." He gestured vaguely at the audience. They liked it. But even as he said it, his tone lacked conviction. He wasn't hosting anymore. He was reacting. Barron didn't respond immediately. He let the moment breathe. He let the silence belong to those who had stood up, not to himself. Then he said calmly, "This was never about being liked." Stephen's brow furrowed slightly. It was about being heard. Barron looked out over the audience again. "If we only listen to the people who agree with us, we stop growing. And if we only speak when it's safe, we stop mattering." He turned back toward Stephen, not to challenge, but to close the loop. "You invited me here to answer questions. But maybe you didn't expect answers." Stephen blinked, and for the first time, had nothing ready. Barron nodded once, respectfully, then added one final sentence, calm, measured, unforgettable. "I didn't come here to fight you, Stephen. I came here to remind you that not every American has given up." The camera zoomed in slightly, not on Stephen, but on Barron's eyes, and in them, the audience saw not just defiance. They saw conviction. In the control booth high above the studio floor, red lights blinked. A producer with a headset leaned closer to the mic. Are we still live?" She whispered, not expecting an answer. The camera operators didn't move. Their lenses were still locked on Barron. Even the floor director, clipboard in hand, didn't dare signal a cut. Because no one wanted to be the one to interrupt this. Stephen glanced toward the crew looking for direction, a signal, a way out. But none came. He turned back to Barron. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, voice low. Barron offered no smile, just a quiet reply. "Most people aren't." Stephen sat back in his chair, eyes scanning the audience one more time, searching for the laughter, the validation, the rhythm he'd built a career on. It wasn't there. Instead, he was surrounded by viewers who weren't watching the show anymore. They were watching a shift. And somewhere off stage, a young assistant turned to the showrunner and whispered, "Do we stop it?" The showrunner didn't answer. Because some moments don't get cut, they get remembered. Barron stepped forward, just a half step, but it changed everything. He wasn't framed by Stephen's desk anymore. He was framed by the whole room. "I know some of you still don't agree with me," he said, eyes scanning the crowd. "That's fine." His voice was calm, slower now, deliberate. "This isn't about red states or blue states. It's not about owning the other side. It's about asking ourselves one question." He paused. "What kind of country do we want to hand to the next generation?" The audience listened, not just politely, but deeply. "Because right now," he continued, "we're teaching kids that shouting is strength, that canceling someone is justice, that believing in something makes you dangerous." He looked directly into the lens of the main camera. "I don't care if you're conservative or liberal, young or old, rich or poor. We don't need to agree on everything. But we do need to stop tearing each other apart long enough to remember what holds us together." He let the silence land, just enough. Responsibility isn't something you inherit. It's something you accept. And if we're serious about saving this country, then we have to stop being entertained by its collapse. He stepped back, shoulders relaxed. "I'm not here to win arguments. I'm here to remind you that truth doesn't need applause." And for a brief moment, the lights didn't just shine on him. They revealed him. Not as a symbol, not as a sun, but as a voice this country didn't know it needed, until now. Stephen sat still for a long moment, hands resting on the desk, fingers no longer fidgeting. The room waited for his response, some expecting a final joke, others a rebuttal. But instead, he sighed. Not theatrically. Not for effect. Just honestly. You know, he said, his voice quieter than it had been all night, I have kids. He glanced down at the desk, then up at Barron. They're younger than you. They ask questions I don't always know how to answer. He paused, choosing his words slowly. I tell them to be kind, to be curious, to challenge things. But lately, he trailed off, then continued. Lately I've been wondering if they're inheriting a world I don't even recognize anymore. The audience was silent, not frozen, not tense, just listening. I've spent years using this desk to fight what I thought was dangerous, what I thought was wrong. He looked at Barron, and for the first time, there was no edge in his voice. And maybe I still disagree with you on a lot of things. But tonight, you made me think. Barron didn't move. He didn't gloat. He just stood. Stephen exhaled again. Then, almost in a whisper, I didn't expect that. There was no applause. No dramatic music. Just a moment between two people, once divided by ideology, now joined by something rarer. Truth. Barron didn't hesitate. He took one step forward, then extended his hand. Not as a politician. Not as a performer. As a man. Stephen looked at it for a second. Then, he stood. No applause, no music, just movement. He reached out hesitantly at first, then firmly. Their hands met in the center of the stage. 2 generations, 2 worldviews. One moment of mutual recognition. I still disagree with you, Stephen said quietly. I know, Barron replied. That's why it matters. They let go. And for the first time all night, the audience didn't know whether to cheer or just sit in silence. Because what they'd witnessed wasn't victory, it was conviction meeting courage. Barron turned back toward the audience, his face calm, almost serene. The studio was silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, of thought, of breath, of something America hadn't felt in a while, stillness. He looked across the crowd at strangers, skeptics, supporters. And then, softly, he said, if we want to save this country, we have to start by listening to the people we've been taught to hate. No thunderous applause, no dramatic music cue. Just silence, the kind of silence that means people are thinking. The camera slowly pulled back. Stephen Colbert stood frozen behind his desk, the lights dimmed ever so slightly. And Barron? He stepped away from the stage. Not as a politician, not as a Trump, but as a young American who refused to be silent. If this story moved you, don't scroll away. Subscribe now and be part of something real. Because in a world full of noise, we choose to tell the stories that still matter. Stories of courage, of conviction, of the America we believe in. This isn't just entertainment, it's a voice. And if you're still listening, maybe it's yours too.